Hi, everyone. Well, I want to talk today about a concept or a duality that was kind of germinating in my mind. And I want to just talk about that and get your reaction, see what you think. I'm also, if you notice here in the sidebar, if you're tuning in live, usually what happens with a lot of these videos is that I obviously don't have a script or anything. I'm just talking to you, but depending on what the subject is and how much I've thought about it, sometimes I have broad notes that I work off of. So if you're seeing those notes there and they're not terribly coherent, it's because that's at the extent to which I've put any of this down on paper, but I thought it might help you anyway. So I was thinking about why there are so many different types of conflicts and so many different misunderstandings really at all levels of society. And one paradigm that I want to throw out there is that there, at the risk of being simplistic, there are really, if you think about it, two big paradigms that people tend to fall into or tend to operate under. And those are what I'm going to call or coin here preservation orientation versus change orientation. So with preservation orientation, what I'm arguing here is basically people who their overall impetus, their overall motivation, their overall actions are all aligned with a big meta goal that's more oriented around preserving what they have, of maintaining what they have, of keeping a certain status quo, a certain set of traditions or routines in place. Versus people who are change oriented, who broadly want to disrupt things, who want something new, who want something innovative, who just are seeking to change the current status quo or certain paradigm. And I think you can really see this duality, this preservation versus change orientation, at three big levels. One is at the individual level. So the big question to ask here is, does an individual, do they want to change? Is there something about them that they're proactively motivated to want to change, want to fix, want to improve, or are they basically happy with who they are? So to kind of caricature these, someone on the extreme change agent might be like the guy who's a narco-libertarian guy who's hanging out in self-help groups and is always testing out a new routine, a new habit, taking different medications, testing out different self-help routines, trying out new ideas, new sorts of things, versus on the other end, the preservation-oriented person might be like an older church lady who's been working in the same job, going to the same church, has the same friends, for 80 years. Their thinking on religion or whatever hasn't substantially changed. They voted for the same political party for eternity. So one is at the individual level. The second is at the level of ideology, and basically there's a big question here: is change desirable? So one way that you can think about this is, if you look I remember in college I took a course. I think the title was something like "The Purpose of History." It was with Gordon Wood, the famous American historian. And one of the things I remember we talked about was when you look at different countries and the degree to which they treat history, or they're historically minded, a big determinant of how seriously they take history, how rigorous they are about documenting it, about thinking about it, really comes down to how much of a feature is change in that society, and then how much is it desirable. So obviously here again, to look at the extremes, on the extreme change end would be a revolutionary ideology, like a true believing Marxist or a communist or a guerrilla fighter, someone like that, someone who's really just out as a matter of ideology to believe that change needs to happen. It's an imperative. It's a good thing. On the other hand, is someone very who just believes as a matter of ideology that things should not change. This might be the fundamentalist, someone who wants to just preserve things the way they are, maybe, or maybe this could take the form of like a Burkean kind of a conservative, someone who really reveres tradition, reveres status quo. And then the third big issue here is at the level of culture. And I think that this is particular, but by culture, I mean, is there a culture? Are there institutions? Are there systems? Are there ways of doing things that broadly encourage or discourage change? And I think that this often you can observe in business or corporate cultures in particular, that whatever they say about the imperative of change or innovating or whatever, you can very clearly see whether or not an institution or a system is broadly set up to actually foster and cultivate change. Here, to take the extremes here, on the real change agent end might be like a very young startup full of teenage or men in their early 20s, and they're a small team, and they're out to disrupt a certain industry, and that's their mindset. On the other end would be a very old corporation with a unionized labor force, people who sort of worked there for long periods of time, and so there, the CEO or whatever might talk about the importance of change, but if you look at how they hire, what they reward internally in their bureaucracies, et cetera, it's basically an operation that's designed to preserve what they have, keep doing what they're doing, rely on old models, that sort of thing. Now, as you can see by these dualities, there are obviously pros and cons of having a preservation orientation versus a change orientation. And I think particularly in our diversity-minded culture, there's a tendency to think, well, you want to have many different types of people in a group all working together. I think that's certainly true, but I also want to make the argument here that there's a risk in this diversity orientation or this mindset that everyone has this unique kind of a way of doing things, or that there's no right or wrong, because I do think that we're increasingly entering a period or a paradigm where change orientation is what's going to be rewarded, where increasingly preservation orientation is something that is going to end up being increasingly on the defensive. And the reason I say that, I'm not making a normative argument here. I think that whatever arguments there may be for preserving this or that institution or ideology or whatever, the reality is that the fallacy of the preservation mindset is that there is in fact something that can be preserved. I think that has to be a starting assumption, a foundational assumption of someone with a preservation mindset. But I think that we're increasingly entering a paradigm where whether or not we want things to remain the same, whether or not we want things to be preserved, there are forces that are probably to a large extent unstoppable that cannot do this. And so this is the most obvious in the realm of technology, technological innovation. But if you think about it really at the things that most people view as a given or take for granted, like if you think, for example, if you go back to if you went to a conventional or traditional high school, and you think about what are the books that are the great books, the ones that you're sort of forced to read, what they basically are in some sense is, what they all have in common is that they speak to something about human nature, about the constancy of human nature, about the dilemmas of human nature, and how because human nature is this constant thing, that is what informs universal lessons that can be applied to everyone. And but even when you look at the realm of human nature, that's changing very rapidly. And the easiest way to see this is that if you look at like things like the internet or screen time or smartphones or TV or whatever, things that we now take for granted but are in fact very radical from an evolutionary standpoint, you can very clearly see when you look at brain scans or whatever, just how profoundly they rewire our brain. And I think that you can also see this in the extent to which we take a lot of medication, pharmaceuticals, vaccines, all these kinds of things that really have a profound systemic effect on our bodies that really affect us at all levels, all the way up to the level of behavior. And we're really only at the beginning of really transforming fundamentally what people are like, what human nature is like. And I don't think you have to be some transhumanist zealot to see just how profoundly we're going to be seeing change. So the argument I'm making here is that in a world in which there's not a whole lot that can be preserved, even if we want to, that having an orientation that's broadly accepting of change, encouraging of change, welcoming of change, probably positions you to some degree to be able to navigate a world that's sort of coming apart, being disrupted. Now, the obvious challenge here to what I'm arguing is, well, if change orientation is so great, why do so many change agents fail? And the point here is that we all kind of celebrate people who do make change and implement it, and they succeed. And here are the obvious examples are like great political leaders. So we all kind of revere people who fundamentally changed their societies for the better, maybe like a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi or something like that. Or maybe someone in the technology entrepreneurial world, someone like Steve Jobs or whatever. Once they make it, once they create something that we all want or like, we celebrate them. But I think that the reality is that we all also know people who, in the process of change, they end up doing a lot of, they just end up failing. We can all think of the entrepreneur who tries to start businesses and loses a bunch of money. We all can think of, the guy who's trying out a different diet and they end up disrupting their health. I mean, there's all kinds of different things. So I think the question that has to be confronted here is if being a change agent is so great, why do people who try to change so often seemingly fail? And I want to argue that there are three big reasons for why that is. Number one is that when you try to change something, especially if you do so suddenly or quickly, the consequences of your actions are often more immediate. So if you take let's take the realm of diet, for example. Let's say that you just tend to eat at the same places, you have the same kind of diet, you eat what your family is serving you or what your community is or whatever. Odds are that whatever that paradigm is, people are broadly like scraping by, just sort of going on with it. So if you're the guy now who says, well, I want to start eating differently from the family, I want to start eating a paleo diet or a ketogenic diet or whatever, odds are that as soon as you make that change, you're now creating a certain shock in your system, both at the individual level, but also with the people around you. So, if that doesn't work out, as is often the case when you try anything new, there's that immediate consequence that you see happen. Number two is that often there are more serious consequences associated with failing. So, here an example might be take like the 9-to-5 employee who shows up at 9 p.m., like watches YouTube videos, takes a long lunch break, isn't really getting a whole lot done. That's not behavior that's going to serve anyone well over the long term. It's not going to serve the guy well who is behaving like that. Certainly not going to make the company they're working in more profitable. But the consequences of that behavior, that laziness, that inaction, is probably going to just sort of accrue over time, and the costs are going to accrue over the long term. Whereas you think about a guy in a corporation who has this young guy who has all these new ideas, he wants to create a new system, try different things. The reality is that if that guy fails, it could be costing a lot of immediate money right up front. Like if you invest in a new idea and it doesn't work, maybe you're out like $20,000 or $100,000 right away. So at least in the short term, the consequence can be more serious. And obviously at the individual level, I think to really take this to an extreme, like if you're really trying something new or innovative or creative or whatever, you could actually just like die, right? I mean, which is probably less likely to happen if you're just sort of going with mainstream society, going with whatever is happening. And I think that this is probably in an evolutionary sense why most people are reluctant to change or not change oriented, because I think if you accept, as I do, that most of human nature or most of the way we're wired was probably designed to help cope in a Paleolithic caveman tribe. When you think about the guy who like ventures beyond their tribe to do something new, the consequences could be that you end up being captured by a rival tribe or eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or whatever. And then the final thing, which relates to that second point, is that there are very generally just more people in society, more institutions, more powerful people that are basically rooting against the change agent. And the reason is basically that when people try to change, they're seen to be a threat to most people. They're obviously they when you see someone who's really serious about wanting to change, that can be a threat to someone's ego who doesn't want to ask hard questions about whether or not they should change. It's a threat to people who have a certain ideology, where they take certain things for granted. This is why like religious people are often the most closed-minded people, because they're wedded to an ideology that's been developed over a long period of time that broadly apologizes for status quo. Then especially in a culture or an institution where things are not really designed to be oriented around change, the big winners of these institutions are often people who are more preservation oriented. And so someone who's change oriented can immediately just sort of provoke a great deal of resentment or opposition. And naturally, they're the ones who try to make sure that change agents fail, and then celebrate that when they do. So how do we deal with this? I mean, I think that first of all, I can't quite prove it. I think there's a burgeoning and developing literature on motivation, on child development and whatnot, and genetics, that where we'll probably end up coming down. We'll have more clarity at some point on whether or not someone's basic orientation of preservation versus change. I mean, to what degree is that just genetic? To what degree are we born with it? I think there probably is, to some degree, just a natural way that we're wired. But I also think that whatever your natural orientation is, I do think that there are ways to rewire yourself, to change yourself, to kind of play around with your biology, play around with your habits, change your friends group, put yourself in new environments, and you can modify where you fall on the spectrum of preservation versus change. But I think that if you're someone who identifies very strongly either with being a preservation or a change agent, the view that I would offer is that there are actually real limits on how much you can really get along with and work with and cooperate with people who have a very different orientation than you. And that often the sort of quest for accommodating difference, for being in a diverse group, for working with other people is futile, where probably you're more likely just to surround yourself with people who are also broadly like-minded, who share your orientation, who share your way of thinking, and then you can double down on the strengths that you have. You can communicate more lucidly. You can try different things out, and you can see if they succeed or fail. But I think that really, like, being effective at trying to do something, having a unified, coherent team, being in a culture that shares your values, you're going to face less inertia in innovating and trying and failing at different things, rather than going through this futile effort of trying to work with people who just fundamentally want something different than what you do. Okay, that's all I have. Let me know what you think, and I will talk to you soon.